Hey John, how do I know when I should prime my models? And when I do prime, what primer should I be primarily priming with? That's a prime question. Why don't we take a look at that? Okay, before we get started, you gotta admit, that was some prime script writing right there, wasn't it? Now, I won't say that I get more questions about priming than anything else, but I think I get more questions consistently over time about priming than any other single subject. So even though there's a lot out there that talks about it and people talk about priming a lot, I think there's still the need to really discuss the ins and outs of priming. When do we do it? What do we do it with? How do we do it? What's its purpose? And all of those things. Knowing those things can help build a good foundation for the model you're working on. All right, the first thing to examine is, what is the purpose of priming? I think its most basic purpose is to prepare the model surface for paint that's going to go over that. There's a lot of conditions and caveats and things that we're going to look at related to that, but the basic purpose of it is just to make sure that the paint that goes onto our models is going to stick well, is going to adhere well, and is going to look good. Because many of the modeling paints we use, specifically acrylics, they're not real plastic friendly when you get down to it. Manufacturers do what they can to make them stick to plastic well, but sometimes there's still some problems. So primers give a coat of something that those acrylic paints can latch onto. But it's not just about preparing the surface for paint. Another thing that certain kinds of primers can do for us is to fill small blemishes in the surface of the model. So they not only prepare it for paint, but they really do a good job of those really fine micro scratches that sometimes develop in a model. Little blemishes and things like that. I'm not talking about seams, bigger scratches, stuff like that. Those need to be addressed before priming, but they can really lead to a smooth surface, especially if after priming, if you get some fine-grained sandpaper or even just something like a coffee filter or a cotton t-shirt and just buff it down. That process will level out any very fine surface scratches and give you a nice even surface to put your paint down over. Another reason that priming can be helpful is that on some models, particularly Gunpla, I'm thinking of those specifically, priming will help protect the plastic that Bandai uses from the applications of later weathering products that may have enamel thinners or other thinners like that. Those thinners don't tend to be super friendly to Bandai plastic in certain conditions. So by priming the model very well inside and out, you can help mitigate any problems down the road from hotter thinners that you're going to put onto the model when you're weathering it and doing other effects. Another really important question to look at is, what type of primers should I use? Because just like with paints, there's different types. There's acrylic, there's lacquer, there's enamel, there's some that are made up of chemicals that I have no idea what they are, and if they even fall into one of those three categories. There's primers that you apply through a rattle can. There's others that you can apply with your airbrush. So looking at the types of primers there are and what their strengths and weaknesses are is something that you'll need to decide in order to give your model the best surface available for the paint that's to follow later. Another thing to consider when we're talking about primers is, what primer color should you choose? Traditionally most folks use gray or maybe some white or some black, something simple like that. And really, there's nothing wrong with just priming everything in gray. You can work with that. I've used it dozens, hundreds of times really, and it works just fine. However, there are some other choices that you have available and some reasons for picking something other than gray. One thing to consider is, how saturated do you want the later colors that you're going to paint over that primer to look? For example, if you're doing something that's in olive drab and gray and it's a military vehicle, then you're not as worried about the saturation of the colors. So priming with something like gray or black or something like that is going to be just fine. But if you're painting a model, let's say you're painting something in sci-fi, or that you want to really have a finish that pops, and you're going to be painting it yellow, or you're going to be painting it blue, or something that you want to have a really bright, saturated look to it, well, then you need to factor that in your choice of primer color, because there are actually a lot of colors that are available. Now, it doesn't mean that if you're going to paint something yellow that you necessarily have to use a yellow primer. But in that case, you may want to use a white primer, because that's going to help the yellow have more pop to it. You can get certain effects with painting underneath with a metallic primer, say a silver primer. That can give you a certain effect. Priming underneath with an orange or something like that. Now, I've seen lots of different combinations that people use for the color that's going to go over the top. A real quick way of figuring out what's going to work the best is to grab some plastic spoons, put a few different colors of primer over it, put the paint over it, and just look and see, how does this look? And that'll help you determine how that primer is going to work in terms of helping out your final saturation of the paint on the model. Another thing to consider is, what paint effects are you going to paint later on to the model? For example, if you're planning on giving it a pre-shaded look, yeah, you could just paint the whole thing black. But remember, that's going to desaturate your colors. And you're also going to be struggling to cover up that black primer if you're using a lighter paint. I've seen some modelers that they'll prime their model in black, the whole thing, and then try and put white over it. And they will spend so much time working to cover up that black with the white, but still leave just a little bit poking through to show the pre-shading effect. However, if you go to something like an example of white as a paint that's going over the top of it, if you use something like a light gray, or even something that's a little blue or a little brown, that can be much easier to cover over. Another thing you can do when picking your primer color is, if it's available, just go ahead and make the primer the base color. I've done that plenty of times where, you know, I had a primer, maybe I was painting something that was just going to be neutral gray, and I had neutral gray primer. Well, I just go ahead and just make the primer the base layer and then begin putting stuff over that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. Primer can act as paint. So think about that when you're planning on painting it, especially if you're painting a large model. If you can get your initial color in as both primer and base paint, it's really going to speed up the process and reduce the amount of product that you're having to put onto your model to cover everything up. Now, something that I think is really important to keep in mind is the question, does every model need to be primed? Now, before I dive into the answer, let me go ahead and give you a rule of thumb. If you're ever not sure if you should prime your model, prime the model. There's nothing wrong with priming a model. You can't go wrong priming a model. Well, I suppose you could, but you'd have to work at it. But if you're not sure, prime the model. It's not going to hurt anything. However, there are some scenarios in which I've not primed the model and everything went just fine. When I was building aircraft models primarily, most of the models that I painted with Tamiya paints thinned with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. Mr. Color Leveling Thinner is a lacquer-based thinner. And while Tamiya paints are called acrylics, they're more of an acrylic hybrid. They're really just lacquer paints that have slightly different carrier mediums than your traditional modeling lacquer paints. So when I use that Mr. Color Leveling Thinner and Tamiya paints, I could spray that right on top of the plastic and it adhered as well as any primer, because it was the component of that Mr. Color Leveling Thinner was essentially the same thinner that would be in a lacquer thinner if I was using that. So I got great adhesion with that, and I never bothered with priming coats because that stuff worked so well. Now, part of what it did not give me was it didn't give me any microfilling. You know, I talked about earlier about how priming a model will help you see blemishes and things like that. It didn't give me any microfilling. It didn't give me the ability to kind of sand the primer down a little bit, to smooth everything down, cover up the blemishes and things like that. I had to do a lot more surface preparation to make sure the surface looked good before putting any paint down. So It can be a little bit of a time saver depending on what you're doing, but it doesn't give you that benefit. If you're going to be using water-based acrylics on your model, always prime the model. Always, always, always. Put down a coat of something that that acrylic paint can hang on to. That's going to be very important. Even if you're airbrushing the acrylic paint on. Airbrushing, brush painting, sponging it on, putting the paint in your hair and dabbing the model on your head. Whatever you're going to do, if you're using water-based acrylics, you absolutely want to prime the model every time so that it'll have something good to adhere to. I've noticed a few manufacturers from time to time say, oh, you don't even need to prime it, just goes straight down over plastic, just fine. That's a real cool marketing claim. But when you're trying to work on the model and that paint's rubbing off because there's no primer underneath for it to really grip onto, you're going to wish you'd have not paid much attention to their marketing. If you're going to be masking, whether it's just a little bit of masking or a lot of it, I recommend priming and having a good primer with plenty of grip that's fully cured, because masking can pull paint up fairly easily if you're not careful. By having a primer coat, you're giving that paint something much tougher to hold on to. And again, if you're using acrylic paints, you just got to do it. But even if you're not using acrylic paints, I would still recommend using primer when you're going to be doing masking, just to make sure that all of the work you've done doesn't suddenly get pulled up when you're taking that tape off. Now, I'm probably being a little too repetitive in saying this again, but the rule of thumb is, if you're not sure, prime. I try to say that anytime I bring up the idea of not priming and putting paint on a model. I always want to try and remember to tell everybody, if you're not sure, if you're new to the hobby, you're not sure what I'm talking about, you've maybe tried some stuff and you're not really experienced in it and you're thinking, I'm just not sure, grab that primer, prime your model, and you won't go wrong. All right, I want to show you a few of the priming products that I've used over the years and kind of just give you my opinion of them and some thoughts about using them that may be helpful to you. Now, if you're looking for an acrylic priming product, go with Badger Stynylrez. There's a lot of others out there on the market, and there's some people that repackage this. Ammo's one-shot primer, and I think it's called UMP in the UK. I think they make a primer that's repackaged Stynylrez, but I apologize, I can't remember the name. If you're going to use an acrylic water-based primer, use this one. I've used the Vallejo surface primer, and I know some people use it and they say they get good performance out of it. I've never gotten good performance out of it. It goes on smooth, it looks like it's going down just really nice, and I'll give it some time to dry. I've given it as much as 48 hours to dry. And then I begin handling the model just a little bit, and it rubs off. I can always tell when looking back at photos of models in progress, I can always tell when I primed it with Vallejo surface primer, because most of the edges around the features of the model are worn off. So this Badger Stynylrez, I haven't had that problem. This seems to be a much more durable primer. Now again, if you use Vallejo surface primer and it's working for you, stick with it. Some products work for some people and not for others, and I've just given up trying to figure out why. But I don't think you can go wrong with acrylic primers when you stick with Badger Stynylrez. Now, for more durable priming, I like using products from Mr. Hobby. Both the Mr. Surfacer, you can get the 1500, the 1200, the 1000, and just thin them with Mr. Color Leveling Thinner. They've also got this mahogany primer, which I absolutely love. This stuff is quickly becoming my favorite primer because it just looks so good when it goes on, and it dries so smooth and it grips so well. These can be applied with an airbrush. You would thin it with some kind of lacquer thinner. My preference is Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, but there's others that you can use. And you thin it down. You'll have to experiment with the ratios a little bit until you get it dialed in just right. But once you get it dialed in, this is a fabulous primer to use. Now, there's also some surface primers that are like this from Tamiya and other companies. I've used Tamiya's surface primer that you can thin and put in your airbrush. I just don't think it works as well as these do. It's not bad. It's like, these are better. It's a cheeseburger. This is a double cheeseburger. Now there's also various primers that are more durable that come in Rattle cans. Two of my favorites that I use when it comes to Rattle cans are Tamiya's Surface Primer and more of the Mr. Color Primer. And again, that Mr. Mahogany, I just love that stuff. It's really convenient, it's really fast. This stuff goes on really smooth and you just about can't go wrong with this. No airbrush needed, although you can decant this stuff and spray it through your airbrush. So this is really versatile and it's great stuff to have. Now, there's other brands of Rattle can primers that are very popular. A lot of folks like the Citadel primers that you use on Warhammer figures and things like that, but they can be used on many other things. And the great thing about these primers is they come in a lot of different colors. Now, they match the Citadel colors, so if you're building Warhammer, you're already familiar with them. But if you're needing something like, okay, I just need a tan color, well, this Sandry dust is a great way to go. There's a lot of other colors. They're kind of expensive, but when I did the math on the quantity of product per dollar you spend, it's not much different from the Tamiya and the Mr. Color Rattle can primers. Even though they're smaller cans, they cost less, but when you do it on a per ounce basis, it comes out about the same. Now, one brief departure, but I think it's something worth looking at for just a moment, is priming over metal. Now, these Mr. Hobby kind of primers, the lacquer types of primers, they generally work well over smaller metal parts, but I have noticed that they don't always tend to grip as well as I would like when it comes to hanging on a photo etch or something like that. There are primers that are made specifically for metal that you can apply. My favorite is this Metal Prep from VMS. I just started using this recently, and this is something that you can brush paint on. And because a lot of times you just have a little bit of photo etch or metal that you need to prime, and you don't need the rest of the model to have a specialized primer for that. So I use this stuff, brush it onto the metal. Once it dries, it is not coming off, and paint will grip to that like nobody's business. Then I can just prime over it as I normally would, and I don't have to worry about it coming up. So if you've got some metal on your model, look for specific primers for those parts and they'll really help you out. Now, there's a lot of folks that use alternative to modeling products, and I'm talking specifically about Rattle can kind of primers that you can find at the hardware store. The thing to know about using non-modeling products is not all of them that say primer are actually primers. They may just be enamel paint. They may be something else completely. They may be something that's not really compatible with modeling plastic. So be careful if you're going to try out those alternative primers. Now, one that I have used in some limited fashion is this Rust-Oleum 2X primer. It's supposed to adhere to plastic, and it has worked fairly well. The problem I've had with this, and other people have told me about a similar thing, is I would put it on and it would seem to be dry within about a day and I would start working. But then I started noticing that the model continued to feel tacky for a while. And I realized that this stuff can take a couple of weeks to really get dry enough to put stuff over it. Now, maybe it's the humidity here in North Carolina where I live. Maybe I did something wrong when I put it on. I don't know. But I did find that while this ultimately worked really well, it had some catches with it that if you weren't aware of them, then they could bite you. So anytime you're going to be using an alternative to modeling primers, what I would say is get that kind of primer because they're usually fairly cheap. That's usually the reason people go with an alternative to a modeling primer. I got this for about $3. This Citadel primer, can's the same size. Sorry, the can's the same size. This was $20. That's a big chunk. So I understand saving money. And I've known people over the years that say all they have used is things like Rust-Oleum primers, and they say they're perfectly happy with it. So I'm not saying don't use them. What I am saying is if you've never tried them before, you're going to want to take some kind of test model, put some of this on, See how long does it take to dry. One of the ways you can tell if it's really dry is, maybe you've let it sit for 2 or 3 days. Pick up the model, hold it in your hand for 2 or 3 minutes. You don't have to put a death grip on it. Just hold it in your hand for 2 or 3 minutes. When you let go, is it still sticky? Is there a little bit of tack to it? That means it's not fully cured yet. It's not fully dry yet. So that's something to know. And then put your paint over the top of it and see what happens when you put that paint over the top of it. Does it react well? Does it work? When I've used this, I've found the conditions to make it work. But what I realized is those conditions, the money that I saved really didn't make enough of a difference for the pace that I have to work at for me to just say, it'd be a whole lot easier just to grab my Mr. Mahogany and use that, or grab some of my modeling primer that I can put on with my airbrush and go with that instead. But you have to make the call, but know what you're getting into. Now, one thing that drives me crazy is when I watch a video on YouTube and somebody tells about all the conditions and all the factors and all the considerations, and they get done and they go, well, I hope this information has been helpful. And you're going, yeah, but what do you recommend? What do you use? Because sometimes in the absence of other information, if we go, well, I've seen their work and I like their work, and I'm just going to use what they use and then figure it out from there, I like to know that. So here's some scenarios that I would say, here are the primers that I use and why I would recommend using them. Now, for airbrush application, if you want to use an acrylic primer, go with Badger Stynylrez. I've used others. I haven't found anything that beats this. It comes in a lot of different colors. It's generally affordable as far as primers go. You'll get a lot of use out of one of these bottles. And if you order directly from Badger, I think they have sizes that go up to like 32 ounces. So you can get a lot of primer from them. And with the colors that they have available and how good this stuff is, this is the one I would use if you're using an airbrush and you want an acrylic-based primer. I like this so much, and I dislike the others that I've used to the point that I would say, don't go with anything but this. Now, if you're going to be using an airbrush, but you want something that's lacquer-based, that's a little tougher, I would go with one of the Mr. Color products. Either the Mr. Surfacer, probably the 1500, although I don't mind using the 1000, or the Mr. Mahogany. They make others. They make one in black. They may make other colors. In fact, when I use the gray, sometimes I'll add other Mr. Color paints to this to get it tinted in the direction, to start it heading in the direction of the base color that I want. But if you're looking for something that's lacquer based, these guys right here, they will do you well. Now, if rattle can priming is your thing, either the Tamiya or the Mr. Color product are going to work really well also. I have no complaints with them whatsoever. There's not only this Tamiya one here, there's a fine surface primer that's white. There's other colors. You can get the Mr. Color in gray, and there's other colors also. These work really well. Now, to boil it down to just, okay, John, just pick one right here, Tamiya. It's great. You can find it anywhere. It's going to go on smooth. It's very durable. You can put just about any paint over this you want, and because it's a lighter gray, it's not going to desaturate it too much, and it's really easy to use. So if you get to the end here and you're like, look, I just need to know one answer right here. This is the stuff that's going to work for you every time. Well, I hope this video has been useful in examining the priming process and helping you just kind of look at some of the factors that go into your thinking on priming. Not only about what product should I use, but how should I apply it? What color should I apply? What's going to go over that? How's that going to affect it? And what's going to be the most durable product that I can use? As with anything in this hobby, it's really going to all come from experience eventually. You're going to settle on what's going to work best for you through repeated experiences of applying primer and putting paint and other products over it and seeing what works for you. Now, I understand that sometimes the things I may recommend or another creator recommends, they may not work exactly the same for everybody. I don't know why. I've just seen that happen. But I think that these are mainstream enough, well proven enough, and hopefully the ideas behind why you should use them and how you should use them will be something for you to think about the next time you need to prime your model. Well, thank you so much for watching this video, especially if you're still watching at this point. I'm always grateful when people hang around to the end of the video because I see the analytics, and when it gets towards the end, it just kind of goes like that. So I appreciate you hanging around to the end. Now, of course, there's a subscribe link down over here. Be sure and hit that if you haven't already done so, and hit the little bell icon so you'll know when I have new videos coming out. That really helps me out, and I do appreciate it. Also, if you would drop a comment down below and maybe leave a like on this video, that will really help me in growing the channel, and I would be very grateful for that also. Down in the description, there's also links to social media and my blog if you want to take a look at those. And there's a link to Patreon if you would like to support the work that I do. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for that. It really does mean a lot to me and my family that you come alongside us and that you help us in this way so that I can do what I do at the pace I do it with the materials that I do it, because otherwise I just wouldn't be able to afford it. So thank you very much. And finally, with all that being said, I'll leave you with one final thought, as I always like to do. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.